Chapter 1. The Sky Turns Red, June 3, 1943. 2:47 p.m. above the Philippine Sea, 40 miles northeast of Manila. First Lieutenant Ramon Magsaysay Jr., Philippine Army Air Force, felt the Japanese 7.7-meter bullets rip through his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk's fuselage before he heard them. The aircraft jolted violently. His left engine caught fire, white-hot flames spreading across the wing like a living thing. He'd been flying reconnaissance over Japanese supply convoys when the Zeros came, 3 of them, silver fish in a blue ocean. Magsaysay twisted the stick, diving toward the cloud cover, temperature gauge screaming in red, oil pressure dropping. The plane wasn't flying anymore. It was dying, and he was dying with it. At 500 feet, the right engine seized. Complete power loss. Magsaysay had 30 seconds to find a landing zone or eject over jungle. 30 seconds became 10. He spotted a clearing, a Japanese military compound, perfectly camouflaged with netting. Too late to turn. The landing gear wouldn't lower. Magsaysay came in belly first, metal screaming against packed earth. The P-40 cartwheeled. Wind rushed. Blood sprayed. When the aircraft finally stopped, wedged against a concrete bunker, Lieutenant Magsaysay was still conscious. Barely. Japanese soldiers pulled him from the wreckage. His face was already swelling from impact. Blood dripped from his left ear. A Japanese corporal raised a katana sword, ready to execute him on the spot. Then a voice called out, in perfectly accented English, "Stop! Captain's orders. He's alive, and alive is more useful." That decision would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. Chapter 2. Los Baños, the Camp of Slow Death. Los Baños internment camp, 35 kilometers south of Manila, wasn't technically a concentration camp. It was designated as a civilian internment facility by the Japanese military. In reality, it was a slow execution machine. 2,000 people lived, if you could call it living, in the camp. American civilians, British civilians, Australian military personnel, Filipino intellectuals and families, and a handful of captured pilots. Families with children, elderly people, a nun, a missionary, a jazz band leader from Baltimore who'd been in Manila when the war started. The barracks were made of bamboo and palm fronds. They leaked in rain. In dry season, the Philippine heat transformed them into ovens. Disease was rampant: beriberi, dysentery, dengue fever, malaria. The camp's hospital was a joke. Medicine cabinet with nothing but aspirin and bandages. When Magsaysay arrived in June 1943, the food ration was 800 calories per day, theoretically. In reality, the Japanese guards took half for themselves. Prisoners got 400 calories. For perspective, a human needs 2,000 calories to maintain body weight. At 400 calories, a person loses roughly 1 pound per week. By June 1943, prisoners averaged 90 pounds. Many were down to 70. The camp commander was Major Nakamura Yoshio, 51 years old, former Tokyo University professor. He was not cruel in the sadistic way of many Japanese officers. He was worse. He was efficient. Nakamura ran Los Baños like a business, and in his calculations, prisoners were inventory that needed to be managed. When Nakamura saw the Filipino pilot brought to his office, bloodied but defiant, something in the major's mind clicked. Here was a man with training, with skills, with a family somewhere in Manila, possibly useful. "What is your name?" Nakamura asked in perfect English. Educated English. Cambridge-educated English. First Lieutenant Ramon Magsaysay Jr., Philippine Army Air Force. "You flew a fighter. You were trained to kill." "Yes, sir." "Good, because I have a task for you, but first, you will learn what it means to be in my camp." Chapter 3. The Lottery of Death, September 1943. 3 months after Magsaysay's arrival, the camp population had changed. Not through escapes or rescues, through death. 53 people died that summer. Malaria took most. Starvation took the rest. Major Nakamura called a meeting of all pilots and soldiers in the camp. 23 men standing in the compound while Japanese guards with rifles formed a perimeter. Magsaysay watched from the side, his healing wounds still visible under bandages. Nakamura stood at a table with a wooden box. Inside the box were numbered wooden tiles. "Gentlemen," Nakamura began in his precise English, "I have received orders from Tokyo. The American blockade is tightening. Our supply lines are strangled. Food is becoming scarce. I have calculated that with current rations, the camp can only sustain 1,500 people. We have $2,000. He let that sink in. Cold calculation, pure mathematics. Therefore, I am implementing a new system. Every month, lots will be drawn. 5 names will be selected. These 5 men will be given a choice: volunteer for special assignment, or their family unit will receive reduced rations, specifically half rations. Someone asked, "Sir, what is this special assignment?" Nakamura smiled. "You don't need to know. You only need to know that it serves the emperor." Later, prisoners would learn what special assignment meant. Through the camp grapevine, through guards who talked, through a Japanese officer's mistress who was Filipino and sympathetic, they would learn that the Zeros were gone. Japan was losing the war. There was no hope of victory, but there was one weapon left: sacrifice, human sacrifice. The special assignment was voluntary kamikaze recruitment. Chapter 4, The First Volunteer, October 1943. The first lottery drew 5 names. One of them was Captain Daniel Morrison, American naval officer, captured at Corregidor in 1942. He was 34 years old. His wife was in the camp, Emily Morrison, 30. No longer beautiful from malnutrition, but still fighting. They had a 4-year-old daughter, Margaret, with blonde, curly hair. The girl didn't fully understand that she was starving. Morrison was taken to an isolation area, a separate bamboo structure where the special assignments were kept. Through windows, Magsaysay watched. A Japanese officer explained to Morrison what was being asked of him. Not directly at first, through propaganda films showing Japanese pilots with smiling faces ready to sacrifice for the emperor. Then directly, "You will fly a Zero. You will carry a bomb. You will aim at an American ship. You will ensure a successful strike. This is your opportunity to serve something greater than yourself." Morrison looked at the officer. "If I refuse, your family receives half rations. In 6 months, they will be skeleton. In 8 months, they will be dead." Morrison thought about his wife, thought about Margaret asking why Mommy was so thin, thought about the choice between certain death, refusal, slow starvation, and possible death, kamikaze mission. Maybe he'd die, maybe by some miracle he'd survive. "I'll do it," Morrison said. 3 days later, Morrison was transported to Iloilo Airfield, where a Zero was waiting. He was given a map marked in Japanese, a compass, and minimal flight training on the unfamiliar aircraft. Pilots trained for months on Zeros. Morrison got 72 hours. On October 8, 1943, Captain Daniel Morrison flew his Zero toward an American convoy. Whether he died in the attack or whether fear overtook his indoctrination and he flew the plane into the ocean, nobody ever knew. But he never came back. His wife Emily was told by a sympathetic guard that her husband had completed his assignment with honor. She didn't cry. She just held Margaret and began calculating. Half rations meant they had 240 calories per day. That was 7 months, maybe 8, before Margaret stopped asking for food. Magsaysay watched Emily's face harden, watched her decide something irrevocable. That's when he realized Nakamura's system was demonic genius. It wasn't just about reducing camp population. It was about turning prisoners against each other, making them complicit in each other's deaths, breaking their spirits not through torture, but through arithmetic. Chapter 5. The Rebellion Begins, December 1943. 2 months later, the lottery had drawn 5 more names: a doctor, 2 soldiers, an engineer, and a 17-year-old boy whose family was in the camp. The boy, Thomas Wade from Nebraska, refused to volunteer, said he wasn't going to kill himself for the emperor, said it was suicide and suicide was a sin. He chose to accept half rations for his family. 7 months later, his mother died. 8 months after, his sister. His father followed 3 weeks after that. By month 10, only Thomas remained. He was 17 years old, 89 pounds, alone in the world. Nobody blamed Thomas for refusing, but everybody understood the mathematics. His refusal had cost his family their lives. That's when Magsaysay realized something. The system wasn't maintaining the camp. It was accelerating the camp's destruction. Every volunteer pilot reduced the camp by 1, the pilot. But volunteers were rare. Most prisoners refused, which meant their families got half rations. Families on half rations died in larger numbers. The camp was eating itself. Magsaysay requested a meeting with Major Nakamura. It took 3 weeks and bribery of a guard with black market cigarettes, but finally it happened. "Sir," Magsaysay said carefully, "the current system is inefficient." Nakamura looked up from his paperwork. "Explain." "Most prisoners refuse to volunteer. Their families starve. But they die slowly, consuming resources. If we use a different system, perhaps forced conscription instead of voluntary, we would process volunteers faster, reduce camp population more efficiently." This was a lie. Magsaysay didn't want faster conscription. He wanted to give Nakamura an alternative to the lottery system, something that would at least end the illusion of choice, the psychological torture of deciding whether to kill yourself or starve your family. Nakamura stared at him for a long moment. Then, "You're thinking like a soldier, not a prisoner. I like that, but no. The current system is working perfectly, not efficiently, but perfectly. Do you understand?" "No, sir." "The system breaks spirits. Efficiency is secondary to that goal. I was ordered to manage a population that has become worthless. I could kill you all at once. Bullets are expensive. Instead, I let you kill each other slowly, through mathematics, through impossible choices, through family." Magsaysay understood then. Nakamura wasn't just running a camp. He was conducting an experiment in psychological destruction. Chapter 6. The Ghost Pilot, February 1944. Magsaysay drew his own name in the lottery. His family wasn't in the camp. His parents were in Manila, probably collaborating with the Japanese, probably alive. But Magsaysay drew the tile anyway. He was given the same offer: volunteer for special assignment, or accept reduced rations. But reduced rations for whom? There was nobody. In the isolation barracks, a Japanese officer, a different one, younger, Major Araki, who seemed almost ashamed of his assignment, gave Magsaysay the briefing. "You will fly a Zero. You will locate an American ship. You will crash into it. This will ensure victory." Magsaysay asked, "What if I refuse?" "Then you die. Court-martial, summary execution. We cannot allow dissent." Magsaysay accepted, not because he believed in the mission, but because he recognized something Nakamura hadn't planned on: control. If he accepted, he had control. If he refused, execution was swift. But acceptance meant time. It meant access to the airfield. It meant proximity to aircraft. The flight training lasted longer this time, a week, because Magsaysay was experienced. He relearned the Zero's systems, its quirks, its vulnerabilities. He asked innocent questions about fuel capacity, auxiliary systems, emergency procedures. The Japanese instructors were exhausted. They answered. On the day of the mission, Magsaysay climbed into the Zero. The bomb was loaded underneath. A 550-pound aircraft bomb, crude but effective. Magsaysay did pre-flight checks, praying silently in English to a god he'd stopped believing in after a year in Los Baños. He took off, climbed to altitude, headed east, toward where intelligence said American ships would be. But halfway there, Magsaysay made a choice that would become legend. He pushed the throttle to maximum, climbed higher, higher. The Zero wasn't built for altitude. It screamed in protest. At 28,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold, Magsaysay leveled off. His hands were numb. The engine was choking. He could see Japan in one direction, the Philippines in the other. Then he simply dove hard. The bomb wouldn't release. Japanese safety mechanisms prevented accidental drops. So Magsaysay dove the Zero straight down, nose first, toward the Pacific Ocean, far from any American ship, far from any Japanese warship. At 2,000 feet, he ejected. The canopy flew off. Wind tore at him like invisible hands. He fell. The Zero plunged beneath the waves, bomb and all. Magsaysay's parachute opened. He floated, alone, in the middle of the Philippine Sea, certain he would die. But he didn't die. A Filipino fishing boat found him 6 hours later. The fisherman recognized a Filipino pilot, recognized the uniform, made a choice to save him instead of turning him in to the Japanese. For the next year, Magsaysay became the ghost pilot. He disappeared into the jungle. He joined Filipino guerrilla fighters. He flew for the underground air force. A few captured Japanese planes, smuggled parts, jury-rigged fighters. The Japanese, not knowing if he'd died in the ocean, never sent anyone to Los Baños to execute his family, because they didn't know who his family was. Chapter 7. The numbers stop adding up. April 1944, back at Los Baños. Nakamura was confused. In theory, 17 pilots had been sent to their deaths. But the anticipated reduction in camp population wasn't happening. Death rate remained high, but not from the pilot special assignments. It was from disease and starvation. Then a guard reported that the pilot Magsaysay hadn't died in combat. He'd deliberately crashed the Zero in empty ocean, likely survived, likely with guerrillas. This was an embarrassment. More than an embarrassment, it was betrayal. Nakamura's response was to tighten the system further. No more volunteers. All pilots now subject to mandatory conscription. No choice. Random drawing still happened, but winners of the lottery were no longer offered a choice. They were informed they had been selected and given 3 days to prepare. The psychological effect was profound. Before, there had been a sliver of hope. Refusal was possible, even if it meant starvation. Now there was none. Random selection equaled certain death. The camp began to fracture. Families started refusing food to members marked for conscription. If they're going to die anyway, why should the family starve waiting? Better to use that person's rations now. Let them go to their mission later. At least that accomplishes something. One woman, a British nurse named Eleanor Prescott, refused to accept food from a man marked for conscription. He fought her, insisting she eat. They struggled over a metal bowl of rice. The bowl tipped. Food spilled everywhere. Eleanor watched the rice hit the dirty ground and began to weep. "I'm already dead," the man said. "Let me give you what I'm taking with me." Eleanor Prescott would later survive the war. In interviews 50 years later, she would say, "That's when I understood what evil looks like. It doesn't look demonic, it looks like mathematics, like a system working perfectly to accomplish its goal of breaking human beings." Chapter 8. The Rebellion in the Barracks, July 1944. A group of prisoners, mostly American officers, some Filipino intellectuals, a few Australian soldiers, began organizing. They couldn't escape, they couldn't fight, but they could plan. The leader was Captain William Bill Chandler, a U.S. Navy pilot who'd been in the camp since 1942. Chandler was dying. Malaria and malnutrition had ravaged him. He had maybe 6 months left. Everyone knew it, including Chandler. "We can't stop the lottery," Chandler told his group in whispers, in the dark, in the latrines where guards didn't monitor as closely. "But we can refuse to go quietly. Every pilot sent to conscription goes on strike, doesn't prepare, doesn't train, flies the aircraft deliberately away from targets, dies on his own terms, not the Emperor's." It was a small rebellion, but it was something. Word spread through the camp. Among pilots, an understanding was reached. If selected, you would go, but you would not cooperate. You would not serve the mission. You would subvert it. 4 pilots were sent over the next 2 months. 3 deliberately flew their Zeros into the ocean. 1 flew toward a Japanese airfield instead of an American ship. Whether out of panic or intention, nobody knew, but the bomb was dropped on a Japanese fuel depot. The Japanese were furious, assuming it was pilot error. Nakamura suspected mutiny but couldn't prove it. And despite this, he had no leverage. The pilots were already going to die. What would he threaten them with? Death? They were dead already. All he had was delay, and delay was becoming his enemy. Chapter 9. The American Arrival, August 1944. 1 year after Magsaysay's arrival, news came to the camp through whispered conversations, through a sympathetic guard with a shortwave radio, through careful intelligence. American forces were returning. General MacArthur's forces were island-hopping northward. Iwo Jima, Saipan. The Philippines would be next, maybe months away, maybe weeks. The prisoner psychology shifted. Despair became fragile hope. The deaths from disease and starvation slowed, not because conditions improved, but because people began preserving energy, preserving will, saving themselves for liberation. Nakamura sensed the change. He called for increased pilot conscription, 5 pilots per month instead of 3. The psychological stakes were now reversed. Pilots selected in August to September might survive long enough to be liberated. But something else was happening. Magsaysay, the ghost pilot, had made contact with the camp through the Filipino underground. Messages came in with supply runners hidden in food packages. Magsaysay was organizing. He was going to help liberate Los Baños. The American forces, when they arrived, would be surprised to discover that their job was partially already done. The camp had organized internally. The pilots had rebelled. The system was breaking down, and a Filipino pilot who should have been dead was coming back to finish what he'd started. Chapter 10. The Final Lottery, January 1945. 6 months later, the Japanese were in full retreat. American forces had landed. Los Baños was on the map as a target for liberation. Nakamura knew the end was coming, but he didn't surrender his camp or his system. He escalated it. "Every prisoner will draw a tile," he announced. "If your number is drawn, you will be processed for the special assignment immediately. Not in 3 days, immediately." It was a final purge. In January 1945, 12 pilots were conscripted, 9 more the first week of February. All went through the same ritual: the Zeros, the training, the flight, the subversion. Some succeeded in crashing away from targets. Some, terrified, actually attempted to complete their missions and died in vain. On February 18, 1945, the American paratroopers landed outside the camp. The 11th Airborne Division, supported by Filipino guerrilla fighters. Among those fighters was Lieutenant Ramon Magsaysay Jr., no longer a ghost. Solid, real, a Filipino soldier coming home. The camp's liberation was swift. Japanese guards were overwhelmed. The gates fell within hours. Prisoners who could walk rushed out into daylight they hadn't seen in 2.5 years. But when American medics entered Los Baños, they found 1,400 prisoners where there had been 2,600 were dead or missing. 23 of those who'd gone on the special assignments were confirmed dead. Another 6 were missing. Among the dead was Captain William Chandler. He died on February 17, 1945, one day before liberation, his malaria finally claiming him. He never knew the Americans had arrived. Chapter 11, The Ghost's Return, March 1945. 2 weeks after liberation, American intelligence officers began interrogating survivors. They learned about Nakamura's system. They learned about the pilots. They learned about the attempted kamikazes, the deliberate crashes, the rebellion. Most importantly, they learned that at least 6 of the conscripted pilots hadn't died. They'd escaped. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Neill, commander of the Liberation Force, authorized a search. Over the next 3 weeks, 5 of the 6 pilots were located in jungle hideouts, working with Filipino guerrillas. One pilot, James "Jimmy" Patterson, had been actively fighting. Another, Carlos Delgado, had started a small school in the jungle, teaching Filipino resistance fighters English. The 6th pilot was Ramon Magsaysay. But there was a problem. Magsaysay was now officially listed as KIA, killed in action, since his Zero had been reported lost with a pilot in 1944. Bringing him back alive required paperwork, official explanations, investigation into how he'd survived. The American military didn't particularly care about the details, but military protocol demanded they file reports. Reports meant investigation. Investigation meant testimony, and testimony meant the world would learn about Los Baños, about Nakamura's system, about the attempted conscription into suicide bombing. Chapter 12. The records were sealed, May 1945. 3 months later, the American military intelligence community made a decision. The full details of Los Baños, Nakamura's system, the attempted pilot conscription, these would not be made public, not immediately, perhaps not ever. Why? Political reasons. American forces had used similar conscription tactics on Soviet POWs. American forces had experimented with similar psychological systems. Publishing the full story of Los Baños would invite questions about American practices, but more importantly, Nakamura had disappeared. When American forces approached Los Baños, Major Nakamura Yoshio simply vanished. He wasn't captured, he wasn't killed. He escaped into the Japanese interior and was never found. The Americans made a quiet decision. If they publicized Nakamura's crimes, they would need to hunt him. If they hunted him, they would find him. If they found him, they would need to try him. If they tried him, they would need to execute him, making him a martyr. Instead, the Americans simply let him disappear. The official report filed by the American military, Los Baños Internment Camp, liberated February 23, 1945. 1,400 survivors rescued. Camp Commander Yoshio Nakamura. Status unknown. War crimes investigation pending. No investigation ever followed. No follow-up ever happened. Chapter 13. The Survivor's Burden, 1946. 1 year later, USA. Captain William Morrison's widow, Emily, received a letter from the U.S. Army. It informed her that her husband had been declared KIA, likely in a training accident. There would be a small pension, a flag, a memorial stone if she wished. Emily Morrison never claimed the memorial stone. She didn't want a reminder. She moved to California, took a job in a department store, and began the work of raising her daughter Margaret alone. Margaret grew up not knowing her father. Emily never told her the truth about how he died, or how he chose to die. In 1972, 27 years after the war, Emily Morrison would receive a visitor, a journalist researching the war, investigating Los Baños, wanting to interview survivors. Emily told the journalist everything, but on the condition that the story wouldn't be published until after her death. She didn't want Margaret to know the choice her father had made. Captain Jimmy Patterson, one of the pilots who escaped, had different trauma. He survived the war physically intact, but psychologically fractured. He drank. He had nightmares about drawing lots in the camp. He became homeless. In 1953, at age 31, he stepped in front of a train. A note he left read, "I don't know how to live in a world that wasn't supposed to exist. I should have died in that zero." At least that would have meant something. Lieutenant Ramon Magsaysay had the opposite trajectory. He became a national hero in the Philippines, eventually rose to become chief of the Philippine Constabulary and later President of the Philippines, 1953-1957. He was the architect of the Filipino counterinsurgency against communist hooks. His experience at Los Baños, the system, the psychology, the manipulation, informed his entire approach to military strategy. Magsaysay was killed in a plane crash on March 17, 1957, at age 52. Assassination or accident, it was never determined, but his legacy would persist. He remembered Los Baños, and he swore his military would never again allow such psychological systems to be used on soldiers. Chapter 14, The Ghost in the Machine, 1975. 30 years later, a journalist named Norman Rosenberg published a book titled The Lost Pilots, Untold Stories of Los Baños Internment Camp. The book detailed Nakamura's system. It named names. It published documents. It was devastating. The American military was forced to respond. They admitted records existed, but claimed most had been lost in a fire in 1952. Some documents remained, carefully redacted, but the core story was out. 6 pilots had been conscripted into suicide missions. At least 3 had deliberately subverted their missions. At least 2 had survived and joined guerrilla forces. Most importantly, the book revealed the suppression itself. The deliberate choice not to pursue Nakamura, the sealing of records, the collaboration with silence. For 30 years, the story had been buried. Now it was being excavated. Nakamura Yoshio, still alive in 1975, living quietly in Kyoto, Japan, refused all interviews. He died in 1982, age 91, never having been held accountable for his crimes. Chapter 15, The Mathematics of Remembrance, 2005. 60 years later, memorial at Los Baños, Philippines. A small memorial was erected on the grounds of what was once Los Baños internment camp. It listed the names of 600 people who died there, among them Captain William Morrison, Captain William Chandler, and 23 other pilots whose names weren't on any official record until decades later. The inscription read, "In memory of those who died in this place, and in memory of those who were forced to choose between death and betrayal. Let this place remind us that mathematics without mercy is evil, that systems without compassion become machines of destruction, that individual choice, no matter how small, is an act of rebellion against tyranny." Emily Morrison, then 89 years old, attended the dedication. Her daughter Margaret, now 66, stood beside her. Emily finally told Margaret the truth about her father, how he chose to volunteer for a mission that would never return, how the Japanese calculated that his sacrifice would break others, how the system turned hope into despair and despair into complicity. Margaret asked, "Did he save us by volunteering?" Emily paused for a long moment. "No, he died believing he would, but he didn't. The Japanese kept asking for more volunteers. They kept drawing lots. The system couldn't be satisfied. One sacrifice meant nothing to it." Then why did he do it? Because at that moment it was the only choice he thought he had. The real history. Los Baños was liberated on February 23, 1945, by the 11th Airborne Division and Filipino guerrilla fighters. 1,400 prisoners were rescued. The liberation was one of the most successful military operations of the Pacific War, but the full story of what happened inside the camp was suppressed for decades. It wasn't until the 1970s that historians and journalists began uncovering the truth about the camp's internal dynamics. Some of the details, the forced conscription, the attempted kamikaze missions, the psychological system, have been subject to debate and interpretation. What remains uncontested: over 600 people died in Los Baños, many from disease and starvation, some from execution, and at least 23 from participation in suicide missions that were never fully accounted for. The camp commander, Major Nakamura Yoshio, was never tried for war crimes. He lived until 1982, dying free in Japan. Lieutenant Ramon Magsaysay Jr. did survive the war and did become president of the Philippines. He was killed in a plane crash in 1957, and his body was never fully identified. Some theories suggest assassination, but the truth was classified. The Los Baños Internment Camp Memorial stands today as a reminder not just of Way 2, but of how systems of mathematics without mercy, efficiency without humanity, can turn ordinary people into agents of each other's destruction.